Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into something really fascinating, a chain of logic that connects the way you see the world all the way to your political beliefs and even your personal sense of purpose in life. So let's kick things off with a pretty simple question, but trust me, your answer has some really deep implications. It might just reveal a whole lot about your underlying psychology and how you view everything around you. All right, here's the game plan. We're going to start with two basic ways people see the world. Then we'll see how those views tend to shape our politics and even how meaningful we find our lives. And finally, we'll tie it all together and see what the science actually says. Okay, so first things first. It all starts with your default setting. Before you even start thinking about an issue, your brain has a go-to way of looking at society and all its systems. Now, this isn't just about being a glass half full or glass half empty kind of person. It's more specific. It's about where your attention automatically goes when you look at the world. Do you see what's working and worth keeping? Or do you see what's broken and needs a complete overhaul? So, how does a simple mental habit like this jump into the world of politics? Well, it turns out this fundamental difference in perspective creates a pretty direct path, a bridge really, to very different political ideologies. At the core of this whole thing is a really cool idea from social psychology called system justification theory. And it's pretty simple, actually. It basically says that many of us have this built-in need to believe that the systems we live in, our society, our economy, are fundamentally good and fair. So let's just walk through this. If you start out by seeing what's good in the system, it just makes sense that you'd want to defend it, right? And that means you're probably not going to be a huge fan of big, sweeping changes. Because hey, why mess with a good thing? And that mindset, it lines up almost perfectly with a conservative viewpoint. And of course, the opposite is also true. If you're wired to see the problems, the cracks in the system, well, your first instinct isn't to protect it, it's to fix it. Or maybe even tear it down and start over. And that drive for major reform, that's really the engine of a progressive stance. All right, so that's the politics side. But this exact same lens has a huge impact on something way more personal, our own sense of purpose and meaning in life. It really shapes how we experience the world from the inside. And this is where things get really interesting, because these two paths lead to totally different inner worlds. Seeing the system as good and justifiable can actually be, calming. Psychologists call it a palliative function. It lowers your anxiety, makes you feel like you belong, and that builds up your sense of meaning. But if you're constantly focused on injustice, it can lead to this state of moral outrage, a feeling of being disconnected, and that can really wear away at your sense of purpose. And there's more to it. Research also points out that the mindset tied to conservatism often comes with these other psychological building blocks for a meaningful life. Things like feeling you have more control over your own destiny, having a more positive outlook, and having really clear moral or religious beliefs. Okay, let's put all the pieces together. We've got one line from your worldview to your politics, and another from your worldview to your sense of purpose. So logically, there's got to be a direct link between politics and purpose, right? And that brings us to the core hypothesis here. Following this logic, it seems like people who identify as conservative would be more likely to say they have a strong sense of meaning in their lives. Now, that's a pretty bold claim. Is it just a neat theory, or is there actual data to back this up? Well, this is where it gets really compelling. Researchers have dug into this exact question, looking at tons of data from all over the world to see if this idea holds up. And what they found is pretty amazing. A huge study back in 2018 basically confirmed this whole idea. And we're not talking about a small one-off finding. This was a really robust cross-cultural study. The main takeaway from their research was just crystal clear. They looked at data from 16 different Western countries over a 40-year period, and the pattern was incredibly consistent. Time and time again, conservatives reported having a higher sense of meaning in life than liberals did. But wait, the details get even more specific. The researchers found that this link was strongest with social conservatism, defending tradition, not so much economic conservatism. And here's the kicker. This connection was still there even when they accounted for how religious people were. So it's not just about religion. In fact, knowing someone's politics was often a better way to predict their sense of meaning than to predict how generally happy they were. That's pretty wild. So we've walked through the theory, we've looked at the science. What's the big takeaway here? What does this all mean for us at the end of the day? Well, it all comes back to that starting point. That mental habit of where you first look, at the strengths or at the problems, is incredibly powerful. It's like a tiny seed that grows into this huge tree, with branches that reach into your politics and right down to the very core of your sense of purpose. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Knowing this connection isn't about deciding one view is right and the other is wrong. Instead, it's a tool for understanding ourselves a little better, and maybe for understanding the deep psychological currents that guide people with very different political views. Thanks for joining this explainer.